Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar entitled A Simulation Model for Estimating the Benefits and Costs of Incentives. My name is Emily Mayer, and I am a Policy Associate in the Fiscal Affairs Program at the National Conference of State Legislatures. I will be serving as a webinar moderator. As a reminder, if at any time during this webinar you have difficulty hearing the audio through your computer speakers, please use your telephone to dial in for the audio portion. This webinar will be recorded and archived. Next slide, please. The National Conference of State Legislatures is pleased to partner with the Pew Charitable Trust to bring this webinar to you. In case you are not familiar with NCSL, we are a bipartisan organization that serves the legislators and legislative staffs in the nation's 50 states, its commonwealths, and territories. Our mission is to strengthen state legislatures. Next slide, please. NCSL provides several different services, including research, testimony, and opportunities for lawmakers to exchange ideas on pressing state policy issues. This December, we are hosting our annual Capitol Forum, December 10th through the 13th in Phoenix, Arizona. The forum is an opportunity for members to help develop the state's agenda, get context and analysis on critical issues facing state legislatures, and network with legislators and legislative staff from around the country. Next slide, please. The way states NCSL's policy agenda is through participation in one of our 9 standing committees. The issue of incentives falls within the jurisdiction of NCSL's Committee on Labor and Economic Development and the Committee on Budgets and Revenue. The standing committees meet twice a year at the NCSL Legislative Summit every summer and the December Capitol Forum. For more information on these meetings or NCSL's activities and services to legislators and legislative staff, please visit our website at ncsl.org. Next slide, please. This jointly sponsored webinar will discuss a new model for simulating the effects of state and local incentive programs. We'll start with Tim Bartik, Senior Economist at the W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research. Tim's research focuses on how broad-based prosperity can be advanced through better state and local labor market policies. Tim will provide an overview of the model, discuss the methodology and mechanics, and draw some general conclusions about incentive policy. After we hear from Tim, we'll open the discussion to include questions from the audience. Mark Robbins, Senior Officer in Pew's State Fiscal Health Team, will lead the Q&A section of the webinar. Mark and Tim are no strangers. They've worked together in various capacities on ways states can evaluate their incentive programs, which Mark will expand on later. Please feel free to submit your question at any time using the Q&A box in the gray control panel. Make sure to select all panelists on the menu. Mark and Tim will take as many questions as possible within the time we have available. At this point, I will turn the program over to Tim. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you for having me, Emily, and thanks to Pew and to NCSL for sponsoring this, and I hope it's useful to the participants. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about this model that I've developed with others at the Upjohn Institute and also with some help from Pew that tries to model the benefits and cost of incentive programs for state residents. And this isn't the only place. If you want to learn more about this model, I have a book that actually, by coincidence, came out today that you can, if you go to the Upjohn Institute website, it's a short book. It's available for a free PDF download. Called Making Sense of Incentives, and it has a couple chapters that discuss the model, and then it has a chapter discussing how to use such models in evaluating business tax incentives. If you really want to know all the details of the model, back in 2018, there was a 158-page technical report that went into all the details. And actually, I refer to that sometimes when I forget details of the model. There are a lot of moving parts. And sometimes I forget the details of exactly how I did things. And so I look at that report to see what that says. So what's the model trying to do? I think before you can talk about any kind of model of incentives that will be useful to state policymakers, you have to decide what is it you're trying to measure. So sometimes this model is trying to measure the following. When a state hands out incentives to individual firms, gives some kind of state tax credit, job creation tax credit, or investment tax credit, R&D tax credit, deal closing fund, whatever. What impact is that going to have on the real inflation adjusted after tax income per capita of state residents? Average of that and how it's distributed across different income groups in the state's population. So that choice is different from what some other people have done. It's narrower than what some people, you'll see studies occasionally talking about what impact a state incentive program or some other economic development program has on the overall output of the state economy or the overall income in the state economy. I don't think that's particularly relevant because if income goes up by a certain percentage in a state and the population goes up by the same percentage, then income per capita hasn't changed at all. And it's not clear why state policymakers should be very excited about that. And you'll sometimes see studies done by states that focus on whether or not a given incentive program raises tax revenue for the state that exceeds the cost of the incentives. And this model is much broader than that because I don't just look at state tax revenue, I look at local government tax revenue. I look at whether or not the incentive, because it increases population, affects public service needs. Look at effects on property values that incentives might have by attracting jobs, increasing demand for land. And most importantly, I look at labor market effects of the program. Does the program raise employment rates, raise real wage rates of workers, and therefore raise real earnings per capita? And I think that makes a lot more sense than focusing on simply revenue gains of state government, because after all, state government's purpose is not to make money for the state government. State government's purpose is to increase the well-being of the residents of this. So how does the model work? So the model is really one of a state economy, but it's focused on how incentives impact the state economy. So we hand out some kind of incentive to an individual business. We give it a job creation tax credit. We give it a property tax abatement, investment tax credit, R&D tax credit. That has some effect on business location or expansion decisions, or at least we hope so. We think that that might affect the probability that the firm chose the state for a location decision. I'm focusing on the positive aspects initially here in this kind of flow chart. In turn, there might be some multiplier effects of that decision. So we attract this one firm. It has some suppliers, and some of these suppliers may be in the state economy, and that it creates jobs in those suppliers. And then the workers at both the company that's attracted to the state and its suppliers go out and they buy things at local grocery stores, local bars, other local retailers. That creates jobs in retailers. And finally, there are some multiplier effects that occur due to cluster effects. So the idea there is that certain high-tech clusters like Silicon Valley, creating one high-tech job may create a pool of workers and ideas that generates job creation in other high-tech firms. Those multiplier effects then have a number of economic effects, including it causes some boost to housing values and also possibly some boost to real wage rates. The fact that jobs are created tend to increase income per capita of state residents due to increasing their employment rate, the employment to population ratio. Some people who otherwise in the local economy would have not been employed become employed. Of course, the higher wages and property values also increase per capita income. And all of these increases in jobs, increases in employment rates, increases in wages and property values create additional tax revenue that partly offsets the cost of the incentive. All the positive things, all the multiplier effects, the spin-off effects of the incentive on state economy and thereby on the well-being of the residents. There are some leakages in this process and some negative feedback effects that we also have to consider. Oh, and I forgot to mention one other benefit is that if the incentive goes to firms that are owned by state residents, which is not true most of the time, but is true some of the time, the incentive actually directly increases income of whoever owns the company. And if they happen to be state residents, then that is an increase in the income of state residents. Looking at some of as I said, looking at some of the negative effects, some of the leakages from this process or negative feedback effects. First of all, there are a lot of location decisions that are not triggered by incentives. So most of the research suggests that for the average incentive package, only in 25% of the less of the time is the incentive really decisive in triggering that decision. Another way to put it is at least 75% of the time, the state would have had the same jobs anyway. That's obviously a negative. 75% of the time, the incentives are all cost and no benefit in terms of job creation. Another possible negative effect depends on who you for incentives. If the businesses are competing in the local economy, if they're what regional economists sometimes call non-tradable or non-export based businesses, that is businesses that just sell their goods and services in the state, then even if the incentive caused that firm to expand, it's taking market share away from other companies in the state. And that's going to reduce jobs in those companies. So, think of if we give an incentive to a local McDonald's to locate in some neighborhood, it's going to drive the Burger King down the street out of business. Or there's no reason to think that just because you incented a McDonald's that we now have higher demand for food restaurants in the city. You can avoid that by making assistance to so-called tradable or export-based businesses, which are businesses in regional economics jargon. They don't have to necessarily export or trade their goods to other countries, but an export-based business for, say, Michigan would be a business that sells its goods and services in places like Ohio, not necessarily out of the U.S. Another kind of leakage or negative effect is we know from numerous studies that when labor demand goes up, job creation occurs, that population goes up by 70 to 90% of that. So if jobs go up by X percent, population will go up at least 70%. And when you have increased population, then state and local governments either have to increase public spending because the new residents will expect teachers for their kids, will expect police and fire services. You're going to have to expand roads and other infrastructure. So either if you want to keep public service quality the same, you're going to need to increase public spending, which can be expensive, or you have to accept a deterioration of public service quality. Either way, there's a cost. It just depends on whether it's a financial cost or kind of a quality of life cost. In addition, we mentioned that when incentives induce the creation of jobs, they're going to increase wages and local land values. So local prices are going up, and this has some negative effects on job creation. Some other firms will say, well, gee, this is a more expensive place to operate. We're not going to locate here. So job creation in some firms tends to reduce somewhat job creation in other firms. And in addition, that if the increase in wages and prices can have some negative effect on some local owners of businesses who sell their goods and services outside the state. They, because wages and prices have gone up, they can't pass this on to people outside the state. So they're going to have some reduction in profits. And the final thing to note is it turns out what this adds up to is, in general, incentives do not finance themselves. So revenue does go up, but so do public service costs. On net, there's some benefit in many cases, but it's not enough to offset the financial cost of incentives totally. There's not some magical Laffer curve where incentives generate sufficient fiscal benefits for state and local governments that they just pay for themselves. So you have to pay for them. And if you increase, you have to pay for them. State and local governments generally have balanced budget requirements. You need to either increase taxes or you need to cut spending. And that will have some negative, either of those will have some negative demand side and supply side effects in the economy. Side, I simply mean when you increase taxes or cut spending, that affects demand for goods and services produced in the state. The supply side is that it may affect the productivity of different inputs to the state economy. So if you cut education spending, for example, that may affect the productivity of workers. If you have to cut infrastructure spending, that may affect the productivity of business. So those are so-called supply side effects, the productivity of supplies of factors of production in the state economy. So that's the basic idea of the model. It's a model of a state economy, again, focused on incentives. The way it's actually implemented, it's been implemented in two ways, which is good since that's a check on each one. The model was originally written as an Excel model and an Excel workbook kind of gone wild that has essentially expresses different equations for how the economy behaves. It includes some assumptions about the empirical magnitudes of how various empirical magnitudes, including how the firms respond to incentives, how the state economy adjusts, how the policy is designed. The goals of creating this model was to have a model that allows users to change those assumptions. So one of the things that drives me nuts about different models of state economies, and I don't mean to, there are a lot of good models out there of state economy. I mean, I think the Remy model, for example, I think is a decent model of state economies, but you can't, the Remy model, you can't change the underlying assumptions of the empirical estimates in the model. You know, they have their estimates, you can't really change the assumptions. And that's true of most regional models you might use. This model, you can change the assumptions. If you don't like the assumptions that I've used in this model, you can adopt your own. Now, Excel models, it's easy to make mistakes. So the folks at Pew actually duplicated the results from the model using Stata. So that gives some reassurance that, in fact, the model is right. Again, you just simply have a bunch of equations and you simulate the behavior of the economy for up to 80 years. Okay, so as I said, the model has some assumptions based on research on how a state economy will typically behave. And let me mention some of the assumptions you model, which, as I said, can be changed, but these are kind of the baseline assumptions. First, the model, based on a lot of research on how business location decisions respond to taxes, state business taxes, the model assumes that an incentive whose value is about 1% of a firm's value added. A firm's value added is its sales minus its material input cost. It's in other words, you think of a steel company producing steel. It's the value of the steel produced minus the coal and iron and whatever that goes into the steel. It's equal to what's added by the firm's labor and capital inputs. Assume that if the incentive is 1% of value added, that will tip the location decisions of about 10% of incented firms. That there would that 10% more firms will locate because of that. And that, in terms of assumptions, I think is a reasonable assumption. You can get some studies that would say that sensitivity is less than that by a fair amount. And you can get a few studies that would say the effects of incentives and taxes and other cost factors are greater than that. But again, you can change this. The multiplier, you can enter in a multiplier that looks at um, uh, input-out relationship effects on suppliers. And one of the results in the model from the cost feedbacks is that based on a number of studies, the effective multiplier after you consider the negative cost feedbacks is about a quarter less than what you would get by simply looking mechanically at how suppliers and retailers respond to the spending of the original company. That's important because a lot of times I've seen studies of state economies that will use input-output models of multipliers that they get from either the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis or Implan provides such input-output multipliers. There are also other firms that will sell you input-output multipliers. And one of the key things to note is that those input-output multipliers that just look at mechanically at how a firm's spending ends up by its workers and suppliers affecting a state economy overlook these negative cost feedbacks that when you create jobs, higher wages and prices will drive away some other jobs. And multipliers really should be adjusted downward by at least one quarter due to those feedbacks. Based on a number of studies about how job creation affects state economy, the model assumes that after about 4 or 5 years, 70 to 90% of the jobs will end up going to in-migrants and 10 to 30% to state residents who otherwise would not be employed. And that, again, that's backed up by numerous studies. The variation reflects whether or not the state's unemployment rate is high. The non-employment rate is high. If the non-employment rate is higher, you're going to have more jobs go to state residents who otherwise would be not employed. The fiscal impact is modeled. We assume that public service needs go up with population. When population goes up 10%, public service needs go up 10%. And there are various models for individual states for how taxes tend to go up when the economy expands. Some states may have their own fiscal impact models, and it's certainly possible with detailed knowledge of a state and local budget structure that you might well be able to improve fiscal impact models that would be a little more, go into a little more detail on some of this. Now, as I mentioned, one key factor is how incentives are financed. And the model looks at it models the demand side effects of paying for incentives, and it also looks at the supply side effects. It only looks at, the only supply side effects it looks at right now are higher business taxes if they're used to finance things will have some negative effect on job creation. And lower K-12 spending will have some negative effects on the quality of the state's labor force and therefore affecting incomes. Okay, so you end up from this model with some estimates of benefits versus costs. So this model here shows the present value of benefits or costs for a 80-year period as a proportion to the present value of the incentive cost. So what you can see here is that the earnings benefits are a little bit greater than the incentive cost overall. This is for a baseline model. The property value benefits are about a third of incentive costs. Fiscal benefits, as I mentioned, do not pay for incentive costs. They're perhaps 20% of incentive costs. There are some negative effects of higher costs on local business owners. Overall, in the baseline here, and this is the baseline from my recent book, our total gross benefits are about 1.5 times incentive costs. You subtract the incentive costs, and the net income per capita increase is about 1/2 of the incentive cost. In addition to looking at the overall benefits, the model looks at how benefits vary by income group. So what we do in the model is divide the population into 5 income quintiles. So that involves essentially taking all households in a state and you rank them by their income. And then you divide them into 5 equal groups or quintiles, and with the lowest income quintile being the lowest income folks. Typical state economy, the lowest income if each quintile had the same percentage of total income, each quintile would have 20% of income. But that's not the way the economy works. The lowest income quintile, it turns out, in the baseline has about 5% of total household income, not 20%. But the average incentive program tends to provide about 16% of its benefits to the lowest income quintile, times the average. So economic development programs tend to be mildly progressive. They tend to have greater benefits compared to baseline income shares for lower income groups. Why is that? Because a lot of the benefits go to people who otherwise would be non-employed. They tend to be low in lower or middle income quintiles. The bottom 3 income quintiles, which kind of goes from the lower income quintile up to I guess what you could call the middle class, the middle income quintile. In the baseline, they get about 28% of total household income. They would get 60% of income as evenly distributed, but they only get 28%. And in the model, they end up getting of incentive benefits about 71%. Incentives tend to be moderately progressive by increasing employment rates, but they're clearly not as progressive, say, as welfare benefits are. Like welfare benefits pretty much would mostly go to the lowest income quintile. Okay. The model, as I said, allows you to look at change assumptions, and you can change assumptions about the state economy or about different policies. As I said, the baseline is that the benefit cost ratio is about 1.5, but you can increase the benefit cost ratio by various policies. You can increase the benefit cost ratio by making the incentives less long-term and more upfront. Why can you do that? Because most of the evidence suggests is that businesses in making location decisions are fairly myopic. The tax credit you hand out 10 years from now will not affect location very much. So front loading the incentives tends to increase the benefit cost ratio. Business services have a much higher effect, or potentially do. The evidence is that some high quality business service like customized job training, manufacturing extension, have a job creation effect about 10 times that of typical tax incentives, having just a huge benefit cost ratio for these. Of course, these services only are useful to some businesses. Not every business, not every manufacturer needs advice from manufacturing extension services, and not every company wants customized job training provided by the local community college. So it's also easier to hand out cash than to try to run high quality business services. You can increase the multiplier if you target high multiplier firms. Like there's some evidence that high tech firms might have greater multiplier effects in a high tech cluster, and therefore the benefit cost ratio is higher. Giving incentives to locally owned firms also has a higher benefit cost ratio, largely because locally owned firms tend to use more local suppliers. So for example, a locally owned or may be more likely to use local accountants for their accounting services than is true of a out-of-state owned firm. We can also increase benefits. We increase the percentage of local workers who are hired. We know that if the unemployment rate is higher, you can double the benefit cost ratio from 1.5 to 3, because in a high unemployment area, a much higher proportion of any new jobs created will go to the local non-employed, and fewer jobs will go to in-migrants. So targeting distressed areas makes incentives pay off quite a bit more. You also can encourage firms to hire locally by encouraging the firms that you are trying to attract to hire locally. And one way to do that, one carrot way to do that, is if you provide them with customized job training services. through the local community college or the local workforce system, they're more likely to hire the local non-employed. It also makes a difference how you finance economic development incentives. The baseline model I used here assumed that higher household taxes were paying for the incentives. What if instead you paid for the incentives by cutting K-12 spending? Well, it turns out in that case, that's disastrous for the state economy, that in fact, that would have a net negative effect on the state economy. In other words, just, you do create some jobs in the firms you hand incentives to, but that's offset by the lost wages due to lower K-12 school quality. You also could finance incentives by higher business taxes rather than higher household taxes. That ends up actually having slightly increasing benefits, because essentially you're exporting some of your tax burden to out-of-state stockholders. And again, this model is totally taking the perspective of state residents. I'm kind of ignoring what happens. I'm looking at if Michigan's running its programs, what does it do for Michigan residents? Maybe it has some negative effect on stockholders in Ohio or New Hampshire. I'm ignoring that. Now, this model can be operationalized for a particular state program. The model, as the results I'm presenting, use kind of average state characteristics. You need specific characteristics of a state to make the model work. And I also kind of considered a kind of an average job creation situation. You need to plug in specifics about when the firm creates jobs over so many years, when the incentives are provided. And I'm going to be giving a seminar next week at this NCSL Pew conference that talks about the model has been used to evaluate a particular incentive program in Michigan. And the next week I'll explain how that was done and what the results were. So let me stop there and see what questions people have. And Mark, if you can just pass on to me whatever questions there are, and I'll be happy to answer them to the best of my ability.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Very interesting presentation. So I think we move into a time of question and answer. So please use the Q&A box on your screen to submit your questions. And please make sure when you do that, you direct your questions to all panelists. There should be a drop-down button there where you can to all panelists. So as you think about your questions, and we let those roll in for a minute here, I'll just mention a couple things. So Tim obviously mentioned a couple publications that this is based on, and those are available on the Upjohn Institute website. In addition, Pew has an interactive web visualization on our website that illustrates many of the concepts that Tim just described using some stylized examples. So you can find that and a lot of other research that we've done on tax incentive evaluation processes at our website at www.pewtrusts.org/tax-incentives. And so, okay, we've got a few questions rolling in. Let me just start with one. Okay, so let me start with this one. So you mentioned that the model, Tim, that the model looks out over 80 years. Why is there such a long time horizon?
I use such a long time horizon because one issue that's been raised is, and it's certainly a pertinent issue, is what impact incentives have if up leading to cuts in school spending. So for example, you certainly can imagine that, say, property tax abatements might adversely affect school funding, since property taxes are one of the main supports for schools. And obviously anything, since state aid is extensively involved in schools, state incentives could also negatively affect school spending. Well, if you think about how school spending affects the state economy, the full effects really don't occur for at least that length of time, or close to that length of time. I mean, you have people in the K-12 system, and if you adversely affect school quality through spending cuts, you have someone in kindergarten, they're not out of school and really in the labor market for at least 12, 13, 14 years, maybe longer, maybe 20 years. Their prime earnings years are maybe ages, 35 to 54. So that's 30, 40, 50 years later. And then they don't conclude their careers until maybe in their 60s or something. So you really need to incentives that go for up to 20 years, and they potentially have impact on careers that go up to 60 years. So to get a full picture of how cuts in public spending might affect an economy, you need to take a long-term perspective. And I do discount the future. The model uses some discount rates. So $1 50 years from now is not worth as much as $1 today. But if you really want to think about things like educational spending, you have to take a long-term perspective.
Great. So next question, do you make any adjustments for zoning restrictiveness, particularly regarding housing? And then I guess this is a two-part question. Separately, any adjustments for monetary policy effects?
The model makes adjustments for the first. The model includes some estimates of how elastic housing supply is with respect to prices. And for the baseline model that I presented here, I'm using an average across metropolitan areas. But there is obviously quite a bit of variation. Some areas of the country have very inelastic housing supply, like some areas of the West Coast and the East Coast, some large cities there, partly due to inherent land constraints and partly due to zoning policy and housing permit policy. Now there is a much more elastic supply. That does have some impact on the model. In other words, in general, when you make the housing supply less elastic, it tends to mean that more of the benefits of incentives get capitalized into higher property values, and less of it goes into higher employment rates or higher real wage rates. It doesn't have as much of an effect as I would have thought prior to going into this, though. Within the range of what you see, other factors seem to affect the model much more. As for monetary policy, it really doesn't play a role here because this model is looking just at a state and is not really, is assuming that a state changes its policy by adopting an incentive. And the implicit assumption is that national monetary policy, there would be no need to assume it changes or whatever. What one state does is not likely to have any dramatic effect on the overall macro policy picture.
All right, so next question is, can you help me understand how this model is similar or different from IMPLAN or the REMI model?
Well, that's a big question. I don't know if I can completely answer it. The IMPLAN model is mainly an input-output model. Prices play no role in how the economy adjusts. It simply calculates, okay, mechanically, we have data on how firms spend on suppliers. We have data on how workers spend on local retailers. We just mechanically say a new firm comes in, they bring in some dollars from outside the state economy. They respend it on some suppliers in the state. There are workers at the firm and its suppliers respend it on retailers within the state. Basically, the model includes no negative feedbacks due to higher wages and prices. This model is more of an economic model than, I shouldn't say, the IMPLAN is an economic model, just a model that doesn't incorporate any wage and price effects. Leontief won a Nobel Prize for doing such models, so I shouldn't say it's not an economic model. It is an economic model. It's just a model that doesn't include certain factors. The REMI model is a general state model that's not particularly aimed at incentives. Um, they actually have some similarities. They're both general models that allow for wage and price effects. Um, as I said, that I would see the main virtue of my model for this purpose is one, it's designed specifically to look at incentives. Isn't. You can torture it and make it work for that, but it would take a little torturing. And the other aspect of the REMI model that I've used the REMI model over the years, you have to accept their judgments as to how costs affect business location decisions, how job creation shocks affect employment rates and real wage rates. And you can trick the model into changing some of that. I've done that occasionally, but the model, you basically can't say, well, I don't really agree with how you estimate that. I think that wages are more sensitive to job creation than you're assuming. You can't really change that. In the model I have, there's any number of parameters you can change. If you don't like the assumptions I've made, you can change it. And I prefer that because, frankly, we do not have perfect knowledge of all these parameters. And in different states and different circumstances, different assumptions may be appropriate. So I would consider our model allows for considerable more user flexibility in adopting different assumptions.
All right, we've got a couple questions about causality. So one is just, how does the model determine the but-for causation? And then similarly, how can I use this model to understand the causality of an incentive?
Well, the way the model's estimate of the but-for is based on, there's a large research literature on how state and local business location decisions respond to state and local business taxes. The model says, okay, an incentive is really an equivalent reduction in some state and local business tax. We're going to assume a cost is a cost. And if a certain magnitude of tax reduction causes a certain change in the probability of a business location decision being positive, we'll assume an incentive that has that same present value will have a similar effect. If you don't like my particular assumptions about what the research literature shows, you think that business location decisions are more sensitive to incentives than that, you can up that. Or if you think that, as I said in the outset, some of the research suggests business location decisions are less sensitive than what I assume, you can adjust that parameter downward. So it's based on a large research literature. It's also backed up the but-for assumption. I have a working paper that tries to review I think it's around 40 different studies that tried to estimate the but-for effects of incentives. And I think in general, that research is consistent with the business tax literature about how sensitive these things are. I mean, if businesses were as sensitive to incentives as is sometimes claimed, then they would react even more to wages than they seem to do. I mean, because wages are actually a more major share of costs than business taxes or incentives. And what was the second question about causality? I didn't quite get that, Mark. Could you repeat that again?
It was just, how can the model be used to help me understand the causality of an incentive? So I guess more, is it a tool to understand causality versus is there an assumption?
Well, I don't know if it's a tool to kind of understand how the effects of incentives will vary in different circumstances. So, as I said, you can go to this model and say, what if I substitute the housing price elasticity, housing supply elasticity of the San Francisco area for the housing supply elasticity of Boise, Idaho? How will that change things? Or what if I assume the model has assumptions about how many jobs will initially go to local residents versus in-migrants? You can tweak, and that might be appropriate if, for example, you felt that for this particular incentive, that the state or local government had done a good job of encouraging the firm to hire non-employed residents. Could tweak that. So what it allows you to do is to understand how changing different aspects of either the state economy or of state policy affect the impact of incentives. That's the purpose. How much of a difference do some of these policy choices make? And also, how much of a difference do state economic circumstances make to the benefits and cost of incentives?
All right, here's an easy question. Is this model in Excel? All right. So you mentioned how increased population drives up public service costs. What if you are a state with declining population? Does that change that dynamic? For instance, a state might have legacy costs like aging infrastructure that are concerned precisely because the population is declining.
I agree with that. I think that, as I said, the model, the version of the model I'm presenting today is a generic model for the average state where there is going to be some positive population growth. I think it's probably the case the public service cost of additional population is greater in states that are already growing fast, states that have experienced a lot of population decline. You know, I personally think that you could, with some effort, develop a better fiscal impact. I mean, the fiscal impact I'm assuming is that costs just go up and down with population. I think you can do better than that but you almost need local and state specific information and a state specific fiscal impact model. You would need to construct that. You would need to make some assumptions about how much excess capacity infrastructure you really have based on the age of the infrastructure and based on its replacement cycle. And you'd also have to look at how much in legacy cost you actually have that cannot be adjusted. So I agree completely. It would be possible to improve upon these fiscal benefit measures, a more complete fiscal impact model. But although I often like doing heroic things with models, it's a little beyond my capacity to create a separate fiscal impact model for all 50 states.
All right, we've just got maybe one or two more questions, but just as a reminder, if you do have a question, submit it in the Q&A box and make sure you send it to all panelists. So we'll take a couple more. Tim, you mentioned that fiscal benefits are about 20% of the incentive cost, if I heard you right. Does that include both the revenue and the spending impacts?
It's the net impact. In other words, if you just look at the revenue side, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it might come close to covering incentive cost and or even exceed. But what causes that equation to not work for a state is that, in general, having more people raises cost, and you need to take that into account.
All right. Oh, we have got one more question. Oh, never mind. We do not have another question. All right, I think that's it. So I will pass it back to Emily at NCSL to close us out.
Thanks, Mark. Also, this brings us to the conclusion of our webinar. If you have any questions following this event, please feel free to contact us at the email addresses shown. Again, this webinar will be recorded and archived on the NCSL website. And lastly, please take a moment to submit any additional questions if you have them. We'll record them. And thank you so much to our partners at Pew and our speaker, Tim, and a big thanks to our audience for your interest and participation today. Have a great one.
Thank you.